All right, so backing up just a little bit. So back in February 1945, then it was beginning, to look like the Allies were going to win this thing, right? So you had FDR from the United States, Winston Churchill from the United Kingdom, and then Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. They met in Yalta on the Black Sea to basically decide, like, all right, so when we win this sucker, what happens next? So at this Yalta conference, what they decided is that they ultimately, the first thing that they were going to do is they're going to divide Germany up. All right. They looked back at World War One, and they're like, okay, so when we left Germany to its own devices and just expected that they would respect the Treaty of Versailles, that didn't really work real well. So this time we are going to occupy Germany. We're going to split it up four ways. The Soviets get a chunk, the Americans, the British, and the French would each get a chunk. They also were going to divide Berlin up, which was, the capital city, and that would be divided up as well. So Germany would be occupied until basically everyone agreed that, like, all right, we can trust these guys; they're not going to start another war. Okay. Meanwhile, Eastern Europe, all those countries that had been basically taken over by the Nazis back in 1939 to 1941, the big question is what happens to those countries. We were very concerned that even though the Soviet Union is fighting on our side, we didn't really trust the Soviets to like allow for freedom and democracy. We already were very like not fans of communism, right, or Soviet style communism. So we pressured Stalin then to promise that he would allow these Eastern European countries to allow free and fair elections once the war is over. Those countries would all be able to rule themselves, figure out their own system of government. Again, democracy and freedom and liberty would reign in Eastern Europe. And also, Stalin said that he would help us fight Japan once the war in Europe was over. Okay. Now, also, we decided that we were going to create a new international organization called the United Nations, kind of taking the idea of the League of Nations, where this is where we solved problems between countries without war. But the United Nations would have a little different mechanisms to actually like enforce things. Okay. So the FDR then pushes for the establishment of the United Nations. Now, the war ends. Remember, we just talked about Japan with the atomic bomb, and this is going to be the most destructive war in human history. And remember, that's saying something because remember World War One, right? That was supposed to be, the worst war the world had ever seen. But World War II is going to be even worse. 70 million people will serve as combatants. 17 million soldiers will die. On top of that, 19 million Soviet civilians will die. Just Soviet civilians. Again, the Soviets are going to suffer more than anyone, and that's something that we generally don't think about when we talk about World War II. In China, 10 million Chinese civilians are going to die. That's largely at the hands of Japanese, starvation, and also a whole lot of violence. On top of that, of course, remember 6 million European Jews, millions and millions more of European civilians due to starvation and violence, and 400,000 Americans are going to die as a result of World War II as well. So again, the United States, like we get out of this smelling like a rose, right? Hardly any battles fought on the United States aside from a couple villages in Alaska and Pearl Harbor. So we come out pretty well. After the war, also, Nazi leaders are going to be put on trial at Nuremberg. 24 of them will be tried and sentenced with charges or with crimes against humanity for war crimes, basically. And a lot of these are connected to the Holocaust. It's really important because to understand, because a lot of these guys are going to say, I was just following orders. And what the Nuremberg trials push is the idea that, like, even if you are following orders, if the order is wrong, you should not follow it. And that's not a defense that you can use if you're committing crimes against humanity or war crimes. So that's an important thing. So some of these Nazi leaders are brought to justice. Now, many Nazis are going to flee to other places and they will be in hiding. So some of them are going to flee to places like Argentina. Some of them will flee to the United States. Some of them will actually be hired by the American government to develop new types of weapons and rocket technologies, including this new U.S. space system. So, you can totally make the argument that if it wasn't for former Nazi rocket scientists, the United States might never have landed a person on the moon, which is kind of crazy. But again, something to be thinking about. Okay. Now, after the war in the Pacific ends, then the United States is going to occupy Japan for some time. 1,100 Japanese people will be, or officers mostly, will be tried and sentenced also for war crimes, especially against Koreans and Chinese. And Japan also will change forever. Now, what about the effects at home? Okay, so defense industries are going to boom. Unemployment is going to drop to 1.2%, which is crazy low. Average pay will increase by 10%. Farmers are going to do much better because crop prices are going to rise so much. Production will increase. This is going to allow a lot of farmers to get out of debt. Now, remember, a lot of farmers had already gone out of business in the 1930s and some even in the 1920s. But there's a lot of progress. And really, it's going to be World War II that's finally going to pull us out of the Great Depression entirely. All right. Now, there will be a short recession, though, after World War II, which is something we'll talk about next week, probably, because transitioning back to a civilian economy versus a wartime economy, that means like all these factories, they're going to be down for a while because, there's not a big demand for like bombers and machine guns anymore. So that's going to be something that the United States will have to deal with, but we'll talk about that later. The percentage of women in the workforce is going to go up 35%. So a lot of those jobs are going to go back to men once the men come back home. But women showed that, like, hey, these, factory type jobs that you didn't think we could do, we totally did them. And they did them well. And again, kept freedom and democracy alive all across the planet. Okay. This is also going to lead to a much more urban population. I mean, the factories are going to grow, and so will the jobs, which means that's where people are going to move to. So you're going to have much more growth in like the American West, where a lot of like plane manufacturers and things like that are going to be. So that's an important thing too, because the manufacturing is going to shift to the West and the South. Socially, many of these guys who are off fighting, they were gone for years. So that is going to be a big issue. There's also going to be a whole lot of soldiers that, will get married before the war, and then they come back to like their wives who they didn't really even really know. There's also going to be a baby boom that's going to begin right after the war when all these soldiers get home, because a lot of these guys, they leave when they're 18, 19 years old. They come back. They want to start families, and that is going to have profound impacts on the future of the United States. A big challenge, though, is like, what do we do with all these guys? Like, where are they going to work? Where are they going to live? They're not going to go back and live in their parents' house, after going off and, saving the world. So there's huge, huge issues with housing. Again, we'll talk a lot more about that later on. One of like the stalling tactics basically is like, all right, we are going to authorize the GI Bill of Rights. So we are going to basically send a lot of these soldiers off to college or to get job training. And that is going to be a very expensive program, but it's also going to be a program that is going to lead to major, major economic growth throughout the 1950s and 60s. Because remember, like a lot of you want to go to college. Why? Get a good job, make a bunch of money, right? Well, the United States is going to send literally millions of veterans off to college. And again, when they get out, they're going to have these new jobs that are going to pay a bunch of money, and that is going to lead to a profound economic boom throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. Okay, now, the other issue, though, is that, again, remember, African American soldiers, they have been fighting in segregated units, and they just had like helped to save, the United States from Nazis. And remember, the Nazis were like super racist against Jews. So African American soldiers come home and they're like, all right, so we were just fighting, racial discrimination in Europe. And now we come back home after saving all of you, and now we are even more racially segregated. So there is going to be a major, major increase or a major push for more civil rights for African Americans and other minority groups after World War II. So, for example, the Congress of Racial Equality will get formed, and you're going to have a whole bunch of people that are going to be pushing for more equal and fair treatment of African Americans and other minority groups after World War II. And again, that's something that we'll be talking about a ton in coming weeks. Okay. Now, for the Japanese, remember, I already mentioned internment. This is a major issue that's going to take a long time for the U.S. government to even acknowledge that it was a bad thing. The Supreme Court, there's going to be a case called Korematsu versus the United States, where basically Korematsu is a guy whose like property and business was taken by the United States government when he was thrown into a prison camp. Ultimately, the court said that, like, yeah, actually, the United States could totally do that because we were scared the Japanese were going to be loyal to Japan instead of the United States, even though almost all of those people were actually born in the United States and were U.S. citizens. Later on, 1988, Congress will ultimately start to pay some reparations for Japanese Americans who were interned. But again, it still is a bit of a sore issue. Okay, so number 6, then, your last question for this chapter. What were some of the effects on the American home front? All right, that's it. We will talk about this later on. The end.